各位现场的诸位朋友，大家好。欢迎大家回来，我们在台湾阅读香港专区由大陆委员会指导，财团法人台港经济文化合作策进会所主办的这个讲座。那我们今天非常荣幸呢，邀请到刘汉典教授，特别从香港来。那可能先简单的介绍刘汉典教授，他自己本身是新加坡人，对，他在香港教书。那我们在去年呢，就替他出版了一本他的学术的著作，也就是《零的代价》。那主要是探讨中国，但有相当的篇幅也是探讨香港特区政府在 COVID 疫情跟疫情之后的相关的这个防疫跟经济相关的政策。对，那所以今天非常荣幸呢，可以邀请到刘汉典教授。那今天的题目也是跟香港比较有关，就是谈说香港作为中国的超级连接者，那在过去的这段时间有什么得跟失。那现在时间我们就交给刘汉典教授。这个会以这个讲座我们会以英文进行，对，但我们会留一些Q&A 的时间。那 Q&A 时间大家可以用这个国语发问，对，所以大家可能听得比较不清楚的地方，我们可以在 Q&A 的时候再做进一步讨论。
谢谢你，很感谢能给我这个机会到台北，尤其是来到这个书展，我一向来都对这个书展很感兴趣，就是靠翻译了我的书，翻译了我的书，才有这个机会到这个书展。我的中文说的不够好，所以就用英语来跟大家交流。可是在 Q&A 的时候，你可以用國語或是廣東話，好似你比較中意講比較習慣講廣東話，我識聽。因為我教書都是用英語，我就用英語跟大家講。So as we mentioned, this book is a collection of newspaper commentaries that I started writing about February 2020. We recall that February 2020, exactly 6 months ago, 6 years ago, that was the start of COVID-19. That was the start of the pandemic. And then right from the start, I thought that the way China and Hong Kong were approaching COVID-19, was approaching the pandemic, was not going to be sustainable for very long. They pursued a policy that came to be known as zero COVID tingling, which I thought was unscientific, economically self-destructive, and undermine Hong Kong's position as a global city, as an international business and financial hub. And I started writing about all that in 2020, 2021, at the time when those views were very unpopular. Zero COVID was seen as the only correct policy in China and Hong Kong, and maybe even in Taiwan in the early days of the pandemic. So in those days, it was very lonely for me because I was the only one criticizing Chinese policy. And you'll recall also after 2021, when China passed, or when Hong Kong passed the National Security Law, the one in June 2021, it was actually quite dangerous to criticize any aspect of government policies in Hong Kong or China. But because I'm a Singaporean, 我不是中国人，我也不是香港人。I feel I have a duty, right? I have some privilege. 我有优势 I have some privilege, so I should use that privilege as an academic, as a foreigner observing what's happening in China, what's happening in Hong Kong, to speak what I see, what I perceive to be the truth. So hence the collection of essays. Then after the COVID was over, after zero COVID was over, I started arguing that China will not have a strong economic recovery. I said that there wouldn't be a post-COVID rebound, and it has proven to be so. Right? China's economy is facing a number of challenges since 2022, since 2023. It's got a 3-year-long, now 4-year-long property slump. It's got persistent, very stubborn deflation, falling prices, stagnant wages. It's got overcapacity, what the Chinese call nature, evolution. So these were issues I was already discussing. in the book back in 2023 and 2024. So I compiled all these commentaries, about 30 of them, that I've written for various newspapers, and I published them at the start of last year. And in the middle of last year, he very kindly agreed to publish it, translate it himself, even though he was expecting his first child. He was extremely busy, but he found the time to translate it. And I'm very grateful because it allows the book to reach out to a wider audience, to audiences in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, most of whom still read in Chinese, in Malaysia, and of course my parents are Chinese, 他们是受中文教育，我妈其实是本来是台湾人 so they couldn't quite understand my English book, but they can very well understand the Chinese book. So thank you very much for it. So I thought what I'll talk about today is to highlight a couple of chapters that relate to Hong Kong. A couple of chapters in the book, and the title is, why is being this super connector for China, why is it been a mixed blessing? There's been some costs and some benefits, of course, but also some significant costs, which I think are systemically underestimated. They are not taken into account sufficiently in Hong Kong. So just for the background of non-Hong Kong listeners, the term super connector, 超级连接者, was coined by the Hong Kong government, coined by the Hong Kong authorities just before the handover in 1997. They said that Hong Kong's economic future will be China's super connector, right, to the world, as well as the world's super connector into China. And it is quite amazing to me. I'm from Singapore, where public policies and public communications are constantly reinvented, refreshed every few years. It is quite amazing and quite shocking to me that for more than 20 years now, the Hong Kong government still uses this quite outdated concept of a super connector. And I'll argue why I think it is outdated and why there are significant downside, disadvantages to being China's super connector. I'll make essentially 4 arguments, and I'll elaborate on these 4 arguments. The first is that being a super connector of China has not helped Hong Kong do better than other global cities. It has certainly not helped Hong Kong do better than Singapore in the last 20 to 25 years. It has probably not helped Hong Kong do better, grow faster than other major cities like Dubai, even cities like Kuala Lumpur in the last 20-25 years. The second argument I will make, and this has very much to do with Da Wan Xu, right, the Greater Bay Area, which is the Hong Kong government's response to every problem. Whatever the problem, their solution is Da Wan Xu. Whether it's unaffordable housing, move to Da Wan Xu. Lack of job opportunities for young people, move to Da Wan Xu. Hong Kong economy growing slowly, but we have Da Wan Xu. It is, it shows a level of lack of, not just lack of imagination, but a complete lack of critical thinking, right? My view is that Hong Kong's increasing integration into the Chinese economy, particularly through the Greater Bay Area, through the Da Wan Xu, has reduced Hong Kong's economic diversity and make it less resilient to external shocks. The third argument, which became very apparent during the pandemic, is that I think being part of being the super connector has actually reduced Hong Kong's policy autonomy. Hong Kong talks about one country, 2 systems, but I'm sure everybody will agree with me, over the last 20 years, what has really been emphasized is one country, not 2 systems. And in terms of policy and policy autonomy, Hong Kong's space has diminished, and we saw that most obviously with zero COVID. I mean, zero COVID is a domestic issue, a domestic policy issue. It should be left to 2 systems, not one country. But almost right from the start, Hong Kong made the decision, rightly, I would argue wrongly, to mimic, to copy the mainland's policy of zero COVID. Now, zero COVID may have made some sense for the mainland economy because it is huge, it can be self-sufficient, but for a global city like Hong Kong, it was disastrous. And I think it did more damage to Hong Kong than even national security law did more damage to Hong Kong's reputation as an international, open, welcoming city. It did more damage to Hong Kong's that reputation than national security law than Article 23. And then finally, this is more, the last argument is more a policy suggestion. I think in a more polarized, less globalized world, Hong Kong's role should be much more than simply an intermediary. Right? It should be much more than a super connector. It should really focus on enhancing its domestic capabilities, developing distinctive strengths that are hard to copy, say, in the rest of China, and really distinguishing itself as a unique global city, not just as another Chinese city, and certainly not just as part of the Greater Bay Area. So let me elaborate on each of these four arguments very briefly. The first is that being a super connector of China has not helped Hong Kong do better than Singapore. People say, oh, it's because I'm Singaporean, I'm biased. I'm actually, as my other book shows, I'm actually very critical about Singapore. Before I was writing about Hong Kong, before the pandemic, all my previous books were actually quite critical of Singapore. So that book there, also published by Monsoon Zone, published in 2020, is really a collection of critiques, essays criticizing Singapore's policies during COVID. But look at this chart, right? Until around 2003, which was the time of the last pandemic, SARS pandemic, Hong Kong's GDP per capita was always similar or slightly above Singapore. It's very remarkable, right? These two global cities or financial centers of Asia, they had very similar GDP per capita. Both were East Asian tiger economies, dragon economies, and they had very similar GDP per capita. When I was in the Singapore government in the early 2000s, and we would always do what we call benchmarking. Benchmarking towards the exercise to compare, right, Singapore with other cities. Hong Kong would always be the first city in the Singapore government we compared to. That was up to about 2003. But since 2003, you can see what has happened, right? The GDP per capita, income per person, has diverged very significantly. Singapore was growing at about 4 to 5% on average. Hong Kong struggled to even achieve 2.5%. And today the divergence is huge. Singapore's economy is about, Singaporeans are about 70% richer, right? Nearly 2 times richer than Hong Kongers. You might think, what's so surprising, right? Well, the surprising thing is, if you look at the region that Singapore is in, it's Southeast Asia, and Hong Kong's region is China, is Greater China. And Greater China, or China, the Chinese economy, has always outgrown Southeast Asia. Right? The red line on top is obviously the Chinese economy. This is GDP growth for the last 20 years, 25 years, since the Asian financial crisis. And Singapore's region is Southeast Asia, a much more backward, sluggish. If you think of Southeast Asia, you just Google Southeast Asia, and the word middle income trap. Many Southeast Asian economies are in the middle income trap. Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines. Only Vietnam is a bit of a bright spot, right? So you can see in the chart that after China, the next fastest growing economy in our region is Vietnam. But China still grew much faster than Vietnam, certainly grew much faster than the rest of Southeast Asia. And so it is very surprising that being a super connector to China has not helped Hong Kong outperform Singapore with Southeast Asia as its hinterland in terms of GDP and GDP per capita growth. So it's very surprising. The second argument I make is, right, Hong Kong policymakers, when I say, hey, the Hong Kong economy seems to be struggling or housing is unaffordable, the answer always is invariably, but we have this thing called the Greater Bay Area. With the high-speed linkages, with all this infrastructure connectivity. Now it takes me only about 10 minutes by high-speed rail to go from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, right? It's about the same speed as from the Kaohsiung high-speed rail to Hainan. It's also about 10 minutes, right? And it's only about 40 minutes from Hong Kong, about 50 minutes from Hong Kong to Guangzhou. provincial capital. So, isn't regional integration, economic integration into a much larger and reasonably dynamic Greater Bay Area a plus, huge plus for Hong Kong? And in fact, the literature, the economic literature on this kind of integration is mostly positive, but it also highlights some risks. Right? And those risks are mostly political. Yeah, free trade, economic integration is an economic plus. It grows the pie. Right? Increased connectivity, all these, what we call, economists call agglomeration effects. Right? When more people get together, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Right? That's obviously true, but if you do not pay attention to the politics of economic integration, you will pay a big price somewhere down the road. That's why we have Brexit. That's why we have Donald Trump, right? Because they did not pay enough attention to the politics of economic integration. That is why in Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou is almost toxic. Even Kuomintang doesn't try to distance itself from Ma Ying-jeou because it tried so hard to promote economic integration with mainland China. So it's not that economic integration is a negative. Of course it is a plus, but you have to look after the political side of things, and you have to pay attention to those who lose out from such economic integration. And so who loses out? Some firms lose out because they find it too expensive to operate in this case in Hong Kong. If you're a barber, a service provider, you're in retail, you're in F&B, you're running a restaurant in Hong Kong, how the hell do you compete with similar producers in Shenzhen? You face lower costs, much more land, and much lower labor costs. And in fact, it's true, right? In the last 3 years since COVID, there are more Hong Kongers going to the Greater Bay Area, to Shenzhen, every weekend than there are all of Chinese coming to Hong Kong every year. Right? The other thing that integration into the mainland economy, and especially Taiwan, or what used to be called the Pearl River Delta, the other downside that has had on Hong Kong is Hong Kong's manufacturing has completely been decimated. And we all talk about how in the US is no longer competitive in manufacturing, but manufacturing is still about 10% of the US economy, 10 to 12%. What do you think is the share of manufacturing in the Hong Kong economy today? Less than 1%. All of that since the late 80s has moved to first to Shenzhen, Dongguan, and then later on to other parts of the Greater Bay Area. And of course this, you might say, what's so great about manufacturing? Well, as we are now finding out, manufacturing actually creates a lot of opportunities for technology learning, right? For technology development. Taiwan understands this the best, right? You still have a very the world's most globally competitive industry in chip manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, in semiconductors. All of that, right? Electronics, any sort of manufacturing was hollowed out of Hong Kong beginning in the late 1980s. And that has reduced opportunities for technology learning, for technology transfer, for technology upgrading. My university, Kedah, 香港科技大学, produced the founder of DJI, Dongjiang, right? The world's #1 drone maker. He at first wanted to set up his company in Hong Kong, but he found it too expensive and the Hong Kong government too unsupportive. So he moved everything to Shenzhen. And then only after he succeeded, then the Hong Kong government scrambled. So, oh, can you do something in Hong Kong? But of course it's too late. You don't have the skills, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the infrastructure needed to support advanced manufacturing companies like DJI. So you can see this chart. This is Hong Kong's share of manufacturing. The yellow is Singapore's share, and the gray is the share of manufacturing of other small advanced economies, excluding Singapore and Hong Kong. And on top of that, besides being entirely absent of manufacturing, Hong Kong has given up another tool of economic stabilization. Most governments, the most important tool of macroeconomic stabilization is monetary policy, where you either control interest rates or you manage your exchange rates. Singapore manages its exchange rates, Taiwan manages its exchange rates because we are very trade dependent. Hong Kong neither manages its interest rate, while its exchange rate is fixed to the US dollar. And while that has some advantages in terms of stability, what it does is that monetary policy of Hong Kong is essentially set in Washington. It is not set in Hong Kong. So when the US dollar goes up, the Hong Kong dollar must appreciate. So for instance, 2 or 3 years ago, when the US had a big inflation problem, it was raising interest rates. You'll recall that the US dollar strengthened a lot 2 to 3 years ago, about 2 years ago. Hong Kong had a different problem. Hong Kong didn't have an inflation problem. It still doesn't have an inflation problem, right? Because China was having inflation. So Hong Kong also had inflation. So Hong Kong didn't need a stronger exchange rate. Hong Kong didn't need higher interest rates, but because of its fixed exchange rate with the US dollar, it essentially was raising the Hong Kong dollar. Right? The Hong Kong dollar had to strengthen, and its interest rates were much too high for the sluggish Hong Kong economy. In other words, you've got the real economy has been hollowed out to mainland China, and Hong Kong's financial policies, especially monetary policies, are just set in Washington DC. In other words, Hong Kong has no policy tool when it comes to macroeconomic or economic management. And finally, just also on this point about no manufacturing, Hong Kong does very little R&D. Right? These are other advanced economies. Look at Taiwan's share of R&D spending as a percentage of GDP. It's 3.5%. Even Singapore, which you might say is just a trading hub, a financial hub, some manufacturing. Even Singapore has manufacturing, has R&D of about more than 2% of GDP. In Hong Kong, it is less than 1%. Right? Why? Because Hong Kong's economic structure has hardly any manufacturing companies. Manufacturing companies do a lot more R&D than big services companies. Banks do very little R&D. In fact, we don't want banks to do too much R&D, because when they do R&D, it usually leads to financial disasters, right? Like cryptocurrencies, subprime mortgages, mortgage securitization, and all of that. Because Hong Kong's economy is entirely dominated, or mostly dominated by just 3 service industries: finance, including insurance, real estate, right, which does very little R&D. There's no such thing as real estate tech or property development tech, right? And what's the last one? And trade and logistics. Now, trade and logistics is useful, but also doesn't do much R&D. And tourism, right? Tourism is not innovation, R&D intensive industry. So that explains Hong Kong's very low share. So what is surprising here is not how low R&D spending in Hong Kong is. What is surprising is that given its economic structure, it still spends 1% of GDP on R&D. So who's that 1% coming from? Hong Kong's university. The only bright spot in Hong Kong's R&D innovation landscape are Hong Kong's university. And I have to say, even though I'm very critical of Hong Kong, when it comes to the university, Hong Kong has done a very good job, better than Taiwan, right? I mean, in Hong Kong alone, there are 5 top 100 universities in the world, right? In just Hong Kong alone. In all of Taiwan, I think we struggle to even have 1 or 2, maybe 2. Being a superconnector has also reduced Hong Kong's economic diversity. It has become very dependent on mainland capital. Look, this is the share of mainland companies in Hong Kong stock exchanges. It's become very dependent on mainland flows of talent, as Hong Kongers, talented Hong Kongers leave for greener pastures, leave for other countries. Why does this matter? It matters because in the last 3 years, the mainland economy has really struggled, right? To the extent that we believe the Chinese government statistics, the economy has been growing about 5%. I think it's probably closer to 2 to 3%. Most serious economists think that it's closer to 2 to 3% growth. In any case, the Chinese economy faces significant structural headwinds. Right? First, too much debt by households, by property developers, by other corporates, by local governments. 地方政府欠的债太多了，太大了。And all of that excessive debt has led to 2 things. First, overcapacity, too much production relative to domestic demand, and of course that has also produced inflation, falling prices. China has had inflation, fighting inflation pressure for almost 3 years now, since October 2022, for more than 3 years now. I like this chart a lot, and mentioned it in the book. It started with the property slump. The Chinese authorities went after property developers, maybe for good reason, right? They felt that companies like Evergrande, Hengda had too much debt. So they imposed something called the 3 red lines. Every time the Chinese policy has a number in front of it, you know it is not going to be a good policy. One-child policy, zero COVID, right? 3条红线, double reduction. Every time the policy has a number in front of it, you, as an economist, I say this is probably going to end quite badly. And it is true, right? So property prices started to fall in 2021, and became negative in 2022, middle of 2022 onwards. And you can see the correlation between falling property prices and consumer confidence. So the red line is consumer confidence. Why is consumer confidence in China tied so much to property prices? It's because Chinese people hold almost all their savings in property. 70% of their savings are tied up in property. Now, you know this very well because Taiwan used to have a big property bubble also in the late 1990s. And then when it crashed, it had huge impacts on the rest of the economy. So that's the first thing to know, right? So when Chinese people feel that, not just feel, it is really the case that their savings are losing value, right? Property prices have come down by about 30 to 35% in the last 3.5 years. So they're basically 1/3 poorer, right? They're basically 1/3 poorer. They're going to cut back on consumption, right? Confidence is low. The other thing to notice about this chart is that when I ask my Chinese students, why is confidence in China, consumer confidence in China so low? The instinctive response is,因为疫情, right, because of the pandemic. But that is actually not quite true. If you look at, when did the pandemic start? 6 years ago, 2020. Yes, consumer confidence fell, but it remained above 100. Above 100 means it is still getting stronger. And then it very quickly recovered. Right? You recall that by middle of 2020, China had successfully contained the first wave of COVID. And then it stayed strong into almost all of 2021. China felt very normal, right? People could travel, people weren't wearing masks, domestic tourism boomed, the Chinese economy grew at nearly 9% in 2021. And then look at what happened here. It collapsed. Consumer confidence collapsed in around March 2022. March 2022. What do you think happened in March 2022? March, April 2022? That caused this complete collapse. And the collapse in consumer confidence hasn't really recovered. It recovered slightly in 2023 when China finally reopened. But then it came back down. So consumer confidence today is not much higher than consumer confidence during COVID, at the depths of COVID in April to June 2020. What do you think happened in April to June 2022? Yeah, the Shanghai lockdown. This was the darkest, most traumatic, most brutal, lockdown I think the world has seen. More than 20 million people forced to stay in their homes for I think 12, 13 weeks. It is remarkable, and I think what it did to the psyche of the Chinese people is incalculable. Because if you can do this in China's most open, most prosperous, most international city, you can do it anywhere in China. And I guess that was the point when people started saying this zero COVID is completely unwise and unsustainable. And of course, I've been saying that since 2021, since 2020. And in 2022, some of you will recall that the word that was used by global investors, global fund managers was that China had become uninvestable. So not only the FDI, right, declined in 2022, it actually went negative. In other words, existing investors in China were selling, right, were liquidating their factories, their businesses, their properties, their assets in China and taking money out of China. It went into negative numbers for I think a good 6 months in 2022, early 2023. And of course, if anybody has bought Chinese stocks like I have, we realized that in 2021, 2022, they were completely hammered, right? A, because of the Chinese government crackdown on certain tech companies, because of declining foreign confidence in the Chinese economy. And of course, all this has weighed heavily on Hong Kong. Hong Kong is very dependent on flow, right? Flows of capital, flows of people, flows of consumer spending from the mainland. You know, in 2023, 2024, it was just extremely gloomy. And the gloominess in Hong Kong was, you know, very much driven by the gloominess in the mainland economy. On top of that, right, Hong Kong's problems obviously trace back to China, but also America. Why is that? This is the point I was making earlier. Hong Kong doesn't have monetary policy control because its currency is pegged to the US dollar. So, you know, in other words, Hong Kong is suffering both as a result of the slowdown in China. It's also suffering as a result of its misguided exchange rate policy, right? Its currency pegged to the US dollar. So in one of the chapters in the book, you know, I suggest that a few things Hong Kong really has to do to get out of this problem. First and foremost, we must accept that this dependence on economic growth in the mainland is a huge handicap, right? As we are seeing now, or as we have seen in the last 3 years. When the mainland economy slows, Hong Kong basically has economic pneumonia. Right? Although last year I was surprised by how well the Hong Kong economy did. Not because everybody was doing well, but because Chinese companies were doing IPOs in Hong Kong. So that had some benefits, certainly direct benefits to Hong Kong's bankers, but probably not to everybody else. Finally, on the third point, or rather the third point is that being a superconnector has not enhance Hong Kong's policy capabilities. In fact, I would argue it has constrained, it has reduced Hong Kong's policy space. And the most salient example of this is zero COVID. So this is data from 2022, and early 2023. And you can see that in terms of COVID deaths, estimated excess deaths, Hong Kong did much poorer, not only compared to Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, but even compared to Malaysia, which is much poorer. Right? Malaysia is a developing country. Hong Kong is an advanced, compact economy. It did much worse than all these other economies. You might say that Hong Kong has a much older population. That's why its COVID mortality rate was so high. But it's not true. Japan has a much older population. South Korea's population is just as old as Hong Kong, but they did much better on COVID. So zero COVID didn't protect. So people who say in Hong Kong or the mainland that zero COVID saved lives are lying. It's clearly not true, right? Hong Kong had more, adjusted for the population, had more COVID deaths than other countries that didn't pursue anything as draconian as containment driven as Hong Kong did. And then in terms of GDP growth, other economies in the region started recovering quite strongly, right? Singapore bounced back at 3.6%, Malaysia grew by 8.7%. Hong Kong's economy shrank by a shocking 3.5%. And since then, Hong Kong's economy has recovered somewhat, but it hasn't really outperformed, right? It's still about 3% growth. So it's just normal growth. It hasn't had a strong post-COVID rebound. That's why in 2024, I said, some of us said that Hong Kong has lost half decade. In the last 5 years, in the 5 years between 2019 and 2023, Hong Kong's economy shrank in 3 of those 5 years. And one of the chapters in the book says that, unless Hong Kong undertakes an independent inquiry about its failings, about its mistakes during COVID, you will never learn those lessons. And you will continue making major policy errors. In 2003, Hong Kong actually, in those days when the Hong Kong government was still quite open, Hong Kong had, you remember in 2003, Hong Kong was one of the worst affected by SARS. right? And after the SARS crisis, Hong Kong had 3 independent inquiries to investigate the government's failings during SARS. This time round, how many independent inquiries has Hong Kong had? 0. Why hasn't it been able to conduct independent inquiry? Because you can't criticize zero COVID. Right? And in March of 2023, the Chinese government had said that China's handling of COVID was completely correct, 完全正确, which is completely nonsense. I mean, I'm from Singapore. I thought Singapore's handling of COVID was very good. Even the Singapore government would never have audacity to say that its handling of COVID was 完全正确. So if the Chinese authorities have already said zero COVID was 完全正确, how can Hong Kong have independent inquiry? And so you see my point, that its ability to learn from mistakes, to pursue policy improvements, to pursue policy reform, is now much more constrained, right? Because of its role as a superconductor, because of its position as part of China. And this is a more recent article about how even when it comes to Hong Kong's financial role as a financial hub, it is beginning to copy or mimic mainland policies and practices. For instance, IPOs in Hong Kong used to be done in either the IPO briefings would either be done in English or Chinese. Now they're almost entirely done in Chinese, in Mandarin, right? Because most of these companies that are doing public offerings in Hong Kong are Chinese companies. So it's becoming mainlandized, right? Not just in government, but across society, across various institutions like the financial system. It's becoming mainlandized. And of course, it's becoming less internationalistic. The ironic thing is that Hong Kong still remains China's most international city. In many ways, it has become even more of China's most international city. And that's not because Hong Kong is becoming more international in absolute terms. It's because Shanghai has become even less international post-COVID. So this is my last point. I think for Hong Kong to not just recover and to regain its dynamism, its vibrancy, its position as a global city, it cannot look to Taiwan. It cannot look to becoming more like a Chinese city. It really has to be truly innovative, right? And if you look at any measure of innovation, whether it's R&D spending, which I showed just now, these rankings of countries or city-states in terms of innovation, Hong Kong does very poorly. Right? It's nowhere near the top 10. And you say, oh, these top 10 most innovative countries in the world, aren't they all large? No, they are not. Right? Hong Kong is about the same size or only slightly smaller than Singapore, Israel, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. 8 of the top 10 most innovative economies are about the same population as Hong Kong. There's no reason why Hong Kong should rank so poorly in terms of innovation rankings. And then on the left is how vibrant are you as a city of startups. This is the ranking of Asian cities. Again, you see that Hong Kong's ranking is quite average, quite mediocre. As I said earlier, Hong Kong's response to all of these criticisms is, oh, but we've got the Greater Bay Area. And to some extent, it is, it's true that this is China's most dynamic, most innovative region. It's produced most of China's patents, for instance. But post-COVID, Guangdong's GDP growth has dimmed considerably. Right? According to official statistics, if you believe them, China is growing about 5% as a whole, the national average. But of all the cities in Guangdong, only Shenzhen is growing above 5%. Everybody else in the Dawanji, including Guangzhou, including Dongguan, are growing at much lower than 5%. Guangdong as a province, Guangdong always used to one of the top performers in the Chinese economy. Since COVID, it has become one of the bottom performers. Why is that? Partly because of the slowdown in the trade globally. Right? Guangdong is very dependent on exports and manufacturing. But also, Guangdong is very dependent on property development. and the property slump since 2021, 2022 has really hurt Guangdong and Zhou in particular. Hengda, the Evergrande, was headquartered in Guangzhou. It's not the only major property developer, there were many other property developers. In other words, Guangdong's growth model was not very sustainable to begin with. It was always led by real estate and infrastructure development. Yes, they are real engines of innovation and real engines of growth. Companies like Huawei, which is headquartered in Dongguan, companies like Tencent, which is in Shenzhen. But many of these companies have been badly affected by the Chinese government's crackdown on consumer tech companies. Tencent, which is mostly a social media and gaming company, has been hammered. It has lost about 40% of the stock market value compared to its peak early 2021. So maybe I'll end here. I'm happy to take questions whether about Hong Kong, about the Chinese economy, also what else is happening in the rest of the world. Thank you very much.
非常谢谢刘教授非常精彩的分享。所以刚刚短短半个多小时的这个分享，资讯量非常的丰富。刘教授提到几个蛮大的重点，就是香港作为中国经济的超级连接者，其实失去了很多，就是包括这个制造业的减少，然后科研的减少，然后甚至在公共的治理的政策上也受到中国很大的限制。所以包括我们看到在这个防疫时期这个表现，因为受制于这个中国当局这个清零政策的主旋律，而香港自己失去了在防疫政策上的检讨跟这个有独立调查的可能。对，那我和自己很尊敬有教授，所以他是一个批判性很强的一位学者。所以除了这个写书，这个批评这个中国跟香港的这个经济政策之外，我趁机也打一下书。我们之前也帮他出版过一本。这个皮兰在季风带在台湾出版过一本批判这个新加坡这个政府跟政治的书 ，OK， 所以大家的威权政治的困境，新加坡未来政治想象，所以大家有兴趣也是可以找来看。那我们现场就把握时间是开放问题的，给读者跟刘教授交流，大家可以使用国语发问。
Earlier you mentioned the GDP growth drop after COVID at around 2022. And I have one question about it, because you didn't mention two things. One is the trade war between China and the States, like beginning at later toward 2019. And does that have any impact around that? And the other factor is that, as far as I know, during COVID, the manufacturing of China actually had a little boom because the demand really grew. So what does that impact on the growth of and also compared to the death or whatever in Hong Kong during that time? Can you just say more?
Very good question. Thank you very much. So it's absolutely true. So the trade war between US and China actually started in 2018, during the first Trump administration, and then in early 2020, they concluded kind of a trade deal between US and China. So that was the first phase, right? First phase agreement that ended the first trade war. And then of course, more recently, in April, Trump announced these tariffs on China. I think that this second trade war has also more or less ended. But why has it ended? Because China uses nuclear weapons, like rare earths. If you impose all these tariffs on us, we will ban the export of rare earths. And China dominates rare earths, right? Not just in terms. I mean, China is not the only one that produces rare earths, but China is probably the only one that has the ability to process them. So I think the second trade war, this current trade war between China and US, has probably reached a certain equilibrium point. I don't think it'll get any worse. So in terms of how has that impacted China and also Hong Kong, that's really the key question, right? So since 2018, so first let me backstep. Why did Trump introduce all these tariffs, all these, and start the trade war with China? First and foremost, I think, is he thinks that trade deficits are inherently bad. And he wants to reduce them. And before 2018, the biggest contributor to the US's trade deficit with the world was China. So to Trump's very simple mind, right, I got this trade deficit problem, China contributes about nearly 50% of it, so I will whack China with tariffs. So that was the motivation for the first trade war as well as for the as well as for the current trade war. So what has happened since 2018 to this bilateral, this bilateral trade balance? China's trade surplus, or rather the US's trade deficit with China, has actually come down, right, as a percentage. In 2018, the US's trade deficit with China was about 50% of its overall trade deficit. Today, it is less than 40%. So in other words, the tariffs have worked to some extent in reducing the US's trade deficit with China. But guess what? The US's overall trade deficit has continued to increase. Because what has happened? Chinese companies that were producing in China to sell to the US, some of them have moved their operations elsewhere. So even as the US's trade deficit with China has come down in percentage terms, the US's trade deficit with a few other countries has exploded. Vietnam, trade deficit with Mexico, right? The biggest exporter to the US today is no longer China, it is Mexico. But is it really Mexico? A lot of it is still made in China, but the last stage of assembly is now done in Mexico, right? Or the last stage of assembly is now done in Vietnam. So Trump's policies are very misguided, right? If you slap tariffs to reduce your trade deficit, it's like playing this game, right? Last time there's this arcade game called Whack-A-Mole, right? 有一个头出来，你去敲那个头，另外一个头会出来，and you never win, right? So the basic problem in the US is that its high trade deficit is simply the result of too little savings, right? Too little investment in manufacturing over the years, right? And too much consumption. So if China, in other words, the US's trade deficit is a made in US problem. There's too little savings and too little investment in manufacturing. And so it's very dependent on exports from the rest of the world. In the case of China, it has this huge trade surplus. Last year, China's trade surplus reached more than $1 trillion US. That's more than 5% of China's GDP. China's trade surplus now, with the rest of the whole world, is the highest it has ever been. Back in about 20 years ago, just before the global financial crisis, China's trade surplus was about 10% of its GDP, right? Higher than today's 5%. But of course, today's China's GDP is much bigger than China's GDP 20 years ago. So 5% of China's GDP today is much larger than China's trade surplus of about 10% of its GDP back in those days. China's trade surplus of 5% of its GDP is about 1% of global GDP. Right? It is actually very large. And it is even larger if you look at the composition of China's trade surplus, right? China's trade surplus in goods is about $1.5 trillion. Right? China runs a trade deficit in services, right? It buys services from other countries, like, including the US. It buys a lot of services from Hong Kong, business services, financial services. But overall, its trade deficit is $1 trillion or 5% of China's GDP. But its trade surplus in goods is massive. It's more than 1%. I think it's close to 1.5% of global GDP. So you might think this is a good thing, right? But actually, just as the US trade deficit reflects the US's domestic problems, not enough savings, too little investment in manufacturing, China's trade surplus reflects domestic problems in China. Too little consumption, people cutting back on spending, not willing to overcapacity. So China has to sell all this stuff elsewhere cheaply. And I used to live in Singapore. You will know that 车子在新加坡很贵，对吗？你买一部新加坡你买一部车，你在台湾可以买5-6部。So I never look at car prices in Singapore. But when I moved to Hong Kong, I started looking at car prices. And the price of China-made electric vehicles in Hong Kong have come down by about 25 to 30% in the last 2 years. Is it because BYD has become very much more efficient? Of course not. Is that there's so much oversupply that they are selling it virtually at cost, right? No profit, to get rid of that oversupply. And because in China they cannot do too much of that, you'll get into trouble with the government. The government now says, this is nature, right? You cannot cut prices so much. So what do? They cut prices overseas markets. So you might think that China's trade surplus is a sign of strength for China, but actually, I would argue it is equally a sign of weakness. It reflects weak domestic production. And of course, it's also a sign, it's a source of vulnerability for China. Because when you are such a big economy, right, you're the world's largest trading economy, the world's largest manufacturing economy, and you're exporting so much of your cheap goods, your oversupply abroad, it's going to provoke a backlash. It has already provoked a backlash because now the US, the Europeans have also started introducing tariffs of some sort. In Southeast Asia, where I'm from, many governments are very upset, right, with the fact that China is causing deindustrialization and exporting deflation to their economies. So back to the question of so the trade surplus, the China's trade surplus is not a good thing necessarily for China. What about for Hong Kong? Well, Hong Kong, technically speaking, is also a trade partner with China. Just as China exports deflation to Southeast Asia, it is also exporting deflation to Hong Kong, right? Whether in services, right, where people can consume a lot more cheaply, just across the border, 10 minutes away in Shenzhen, or, okay, Hong Kong doesn't produce many more, doesn't have much manufacturing anymore, so there is not much manufacturing deflationary pressure from China. But deflation of services, the prices, is enormous. I mean, as a consumer, I don't produce any services other than sell books in Hong Kong, so I'm not really hurt, right? As a consumer, it's fantastic, right? Every weekend, the city is hollowed up because everybody is in Shenzhen consuming. Prices in Hong Kong haven't risen really in the last 3 years. But if you're a producer, if you run a services outlet or you're trying to start services in Hong Kong, it is terrible. Restaurants have been shutting down. Service providers have found it impossible to match the cost, the prices in mainland China. In terms of the trade in goods, Hong Kong has benefited somewhat because it is often the port, right, the logistics hub for goods that are going abroad. So to some extent, Hong Kong's trade and logistics, the ports, has remained relatively resilient because of China's export prowess. It has benefited to some extent. But overall, I think the overcapacity, the deflation pressure imposes more costs on Hong Kong than the benefits it gains from China's exports.
对，刚刚也教授讲到一个非常有趣的点，就是中国的贸易顺差的这个漂亮的数字，其实反而是一个内政问题的一个呈现，也就是消费不足嘛，然后供给过剩。那你举了一个例子，跟我也是有点相关。那这个他们过剩的产能就是出口到其他的国家，对其他国家的市场产生挤压。那这在我们出版界就很明显了。因为新马的这个华文出版非常受到中国书的挤压，那以后的情况可能会更严重。因为台湾的出版业还有繁体这个天然的这个保护，对，那新马跟中国一样都是使用简体，所以我们的当地的出版业受到中国出版的这个挤压更严重。那么其他的读者有其他的问题想要跟刘教授交流？
刘教授你好，我用中文问。就是刚才你提到那个川普第一任贸易战，我想问第一个问题是第一任贸易战跟第二任贸易战之间的不同，因为刚刚提到一个点是说，第一任贸易战的时候，你的描述说创想的很简单嘛，他就有看到有逆参法敲案，但是那这些东西它可能是从别的国家再转而进口到美国来，所以这个贸易逆差问题其实没有办法有效的解决。可是第二任的时候，它是worldwide。所以他这个做法上，就你的看法，认为是不是会比之更有效？因为现在我们看起来，确实他在政策面有做这些行为，就窝外的去阻挡这件事情。那第二个问题是，我觉得比较单纯啊，就是说那个中国的数据啊，它真的是准确的吗？就是应该是理所当然不准确啊，就是单纯想理解一下，这是第二个问题。对。 第三个是我想请教，就是刚才最后一段你提到说那个，如果说就是提到这个通缩的问题，就说因为中国的这个生产过剩的行为会造成通缩。那比如说在香港，那也就是你刚刚提到说，对于消费者的影响似乎没有那么直接。可是我一个想法是感觉好像对消费者也会有影响，因为如果我们预期价格会下降，那我们就会紧逼消费。比较生活品可能还好，但是像房子、车子，那我会等到明年它降了再买。对，就是这三个问题。
最后一个问题最容易 respond. You are right. In the short term, you might benefit from cheaper goods, but you're going to delay your purchase. So that actually reduces or curbs consumption spending. The first question is a bit more complex. So you're right, the big difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 is that now the tariff war is not just on China. In fact, China seems to have gotten a good deal, right? It's other countries that have less bargaining power to the US, countries like Vietnam, Mexico, even Singapore, Singapore runs a trade deficit with the US. Singapore also got slapped with 10% tariff. I don't know what is Taiwan's tariff, 10% or so, 15%, right? You probably run a trade deficit with the US, right? You buy more things from the US than yourself, and you also got a 15%. So it is more widespread. Does it work? Of course it doesn't work, right? Because as I said, the fundamental reason for the US's trade deficit is savings are too low. Right? The trade deficit is simply your savings are less than your investment, right? So it is a domestic issue, the fact that you don't have sufficient domestic savings. What it will do, what the Trump tariffs will do, it will not reduce Trump 2.0, it will not slow the growth in US trade deficits. What it will do is it may force some supply chain movements. Right? Maybe some, I don't think a lot will move back. Can you imagine US workers making shoes, making clothes, making electronics, making smartphones? I cannot imagine. I mean, by the way, Apple since COVID was already thinking of moving its smartphone production to India. It hasn't been able to do so. Why? It's not because Chinese labor costs are lower. In fact, Chinese labor costs are higher than India. So why is Apple so stuck producing in China? Because Chinese supply chain is very sophisticated. They are truly very competitive. Right? You go to the Shenzhen, Dongguan, the area, you know, there are lots of competing producers who can produce very high value components at a very competitive cost. If let's say Apple's existing supplier for a particular component faces problems, it can very easily find somebody else. And even if it can't find somebody else, somebody will know somebody who can find somebody else. Right? So in other words, manufacturing is not just about manufacturing competitiveness. It's not just about your textbook knowledge, right? what you know in your head. It's also your ability to implement it, to execute it in these very complex and intricate supply chain. So the whole Greater Bay Area, the reason it is globally competitive in high-end goods like smartphones, high-end electronic goods, even electric vehicles, is because it is a very sophisticated ecosystem, and it's very difficult to recreate that elsewhere. One of the best books you can read, that you can buy last year, was this book called Apple in China. So it talks about how when Apple moved into China, the standards were set in California. Right? All the manuals, all the specifications were set in California. But the actual production of everything was done in China. And it becomes so ecosystem, just like in Xinzhu, it's an ecosystem, it's very interdependent. It's very difficult to move the entire, or to recreate an ecosystem somewhere else. So Vietnam hasn't been able to do it. India hasn't been able to do it. So I think it's very difficult for most sophisticated manufacturers to move back to the US. And the other problem that Trump has created is actually the biggest beneficiary of these outsourcing, right, producing in China. The biggest beneficiary is actually not China. or Chinese workers. You know who are the biggest beneficiary? The US companies themselves. Right? 6 US companies. The 6 are Tesla, Apple, Qualcomm, which produces chips, semiconductors. I think you all know them very well. I think Nike is one of them, and a couple of others. 6 US companies. They produce in China about $11 billion worth of goods. And they produce in China and they sell to the US. This $11+ billion worth of goods does not go towards reducing the US's trade deficit in China. In fact, they add to the US's trade deficit in China. Even though these are produced by US companies, they are produced in China for US consumers. So it actually adds to US trade deficit in China. But these are US companies, right? And the profit, so for instance, you take this pair of, okay, this is not Nike, this is Adidas, but you take a pair of Nike shoes, it's produced probably for $15 US, and it sells for, let's say, $100 US. Who makes the profit of $85? It's Nike, right? The Chinese workers only get, the Chinese suppliers only get, you add it all up, it's only about 15. Similarly with the iPhone, this is produced for about, this iPhone 17 is produced for about $600 US, mostly in China, almost entirely in China. But Apple sells this for more than $1,000 US. Who keeps the profit of 40-50%? It's Apple. But in the trade statistics, it is counted as this is a Chinese export to the US. So it shows on the import side of it, adds to the US's trade deficit. But is it really a minus for the US? And Apple earns huge profits, much more than what Chinese companies or Chinese workers get producing iPhones or Nike shoes. So the real winner in this interdependent trade relationship between US and China, the bigger winner is the US. What the US should be doing is to find ways to tax some of these profits. All right? If it is really concerned about the fact that we are hurting the working class in the US, all these companies moving to China are hurting middle class factory workers or working class Americans in the US, and it is true, it is hurting them. But you really want to compensate, the way to do it is not to have tariffs or imports from China, because who pays those tariffs? The American consumers themselves. They pay most of the tariffs. The way to help them is to tax these big winners of globalization, and then to use that revenue to compensate American workers, American middle class, American cities that have undergone deindustrialization. The real reason for, in other words, Trump is responding to legitimate problems like deindustrialization, wage stagnation, the loss of a middle class, the loss of manufacturing. He's responding to real problems, but his solutions are actually not solutions at all. A tariff is a very lousy solution. It makes things worse, it doesn't make things better. The right way to do is to find some ways to tax the winners of globalization, companies like Apple, Qualcomm, Tesla, and use those revenues to compensate those who don't win out on global trade. And the reason for Trump's popularity, I think, is there wasn't this domestic compensation mechanism in the US. And so it was very easy for Trump to blame all of the US's economic problems on China, to scapegoat China. That is the great tragedy of our times, right? That there are genuine problems, but the response to those genuine problems is actually a false solution, it's a fake solution. And that was the second question. What was the second question? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean that they are deliberately falsified. I met the National Bureau of Statistics. It's a very professional organization. They're trying to do the right thing, but it relies on local governments to report the GDP numbers, investment numbers, consumption numbers, whatever, right? And local governments have GDP growth targets. Their bonuses, their salaries are tied. Their resources given to them are also tied to GDP. Yeah. So obviously local governments are going to falsify, right? Or going to exaggerate their figures. So that's the problem that Zhongyang National Bureau of Statistics faces. The other problem is that the way China presents its economic data is very unusual. It doesn't produce, usually countries, major economies, right, would produce quarterly GDP figures, and they'll break it down in terms of consumption, investment, net exports. China doesn't release this. I don't know if it actually collects this. You only release an annual figure at the end of the year on consumption, investment, net exports. And so that gives a lot too much room for manipulation, for massaging of data. So, and of course in the last 10 years, economic data in China has become more limited, more scarce. And also, this is where it's relevant for me, right? Economists in China, in recent years, if they say anything negative about the Chinese economy, they might get into trouble. Last year, a relatively famous Gao Shanwen, well, he lost his job. Or I don't know if he lost his job. He basically got cancelled because he said that there seems to be a disconnect between China's GDP growth and the inflation rate. Just for saying that, he was making a technical point. He got cancelled on the internet. And so people are becoming more and more skeptical about China's GDP figures, and for good reason.
还有其他读者有没有想要跟刘教授交流？好，如果没有，好，如果没有的话，那我们就是先合照一张，好。